Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second day of the 2023 ACS National Convention. After last night, I hope you're all feeling half as engaged and inspired and energized as I do, and I talked to so many of you. I'm sure you're telling me the truth. You loved the program last night. It was marvelous, and we thank all the speakers. As I and many other speakers last night talked about this country in which a small group whose hands remain firmly on levers of institutional, economic, and political power manipulate the rules and the laws to maintain that power, despite really a lack of real popular support. This manipulation of and sometimes outright disregard for the rule of law will have serious consequences unless we respond. We have to call it out for what it is. And we seek to shore up and reform and in some cases transform our political, legal, and economic institutions. As many of you have already heard, we were going to have a great presentation to kick us off in this morning, but unfortunately due to unforeseen travel complications, FTC Chair Lena Khan is unable to be with us this morning. And I truly was disappointed because I think what she's doing is historic, especially in light of the conversations we had yesterday about economics and the law and the way in which the deal is kind of cut against a lot of the other considerations that should be given with regard to public policy and law. So we look forward to having her here in the future, but I'm really pleased to be having the chance to work with this great panel. A few housekeeping notes before we begin. To receive CLE credits for this program, you'll need to submit 2 codes, which I'll provide during the program, one at the beginning and once in the middle. Please write down these codes. You will enter these codes into the Google form that you received in your welcome email. This form is also available on the ACS convention page under the CLE tab. If you need help with CLE, you can ask one of our volunteers for help after the program or email lcemail@acslaw.org. The first CLE code is OAK, all caps, OAK. We will reserve time at the end for Q&A. Please write down questions on index cards provided at your tables and then raise index cards to alert our staff and volunteers that you have a question. They will collect it from you. And those participating virtually have also been given instructions for submitting questions. So let me just kick it off with a few remarks about what this panel's about. Over the past several years, ACS has been dedicated to further considering and incorporating perspectives on what is happening on the international stage as a part of our work. This has not traditionally been a major focus of ACS, although always there has been awareness. We are particularly focused on issues that ACS, of course, already engages in domestically, such as democracy, equality and liberty, reproductive rights, and the criminal legal system, including the death penalty. This effort is particularly important in this moment we find ourselves in, when civil societies, not only here but throughout the world, acknowledge that we are in a moment of democratic decline. It would be irresponsible if this organization did not connect what is happening here at home, the rise of election denialism, attacks on the abortion, access, and other reproductive rights, abuse of institutional power to strip duly elected representatives of their seats or voices in legislatures, the resurgence of white nationalism and anti-LGBTQ plus animus, and the conservative capture of our nation's highest courts with what's going on around the world. In democracies throughout the world, democratic institutions have eroded or been manipulated to provide space for authoritarian, autocratic forces to gain a foothold in, and in some places, what seems like a stranglehold. Over the past decade to a decade and a half, authoritarian and autocratic regimes have worked to foster a more favorable, not just domestic in their countries, but international environment for themselves, in part because of actually waning pressures from democracies. While not solely responsible, A shift in the United States diplomatic posture in the late 2010s did a lot to create some space and energy for these very disturbing efforts. More so that in the past 30 years or more, authoritarian regimes feel less like holdouts in a democratizing world. Through diplomatic and economic assistance, well-established authoritarian regimes are providing assistance for new and would-be authoritarians, particularly in those countries that have fragile democracies. So anyone who's been paying attention knows that the U.S. is not immune to these efforts. The United States has had a historically robust democracy, but recent events have reminded those of us who are willing to pay attention that there's always been very significant weaknesses in our foundations, and that those weaknesses are being exploited more brazenly than they have been, certainly in my lifetime, that I can remember. The purpose of this panel, then, is to demonstrate that what happens internationally regarding authoritarianism and human rights are connected to what is happening in our country and vice versa. Domestic and international authoritarianism are very much intertwined, and we would actually ignore that fact at our peril. So with that sort of framing, and something that we've spent a lot of time thinking about in the last couple of years, I'd like to turn to our wonderful panel. I'm honored that we have with us today Kate Masur, from the Professor of History at Northwestern University, Craig Jackson, Professor of Law at Texas Southern University, Thurgood Marshall School of Law, who, in full disclosure, has graciously stepped in for panelist Justin Hansford of Howard, who was unable to join us due to travel complications. So we're not going to let two complications with travel keep us down, because Professor Jackson is going to step in and do a wonderful job. Alicia Yamin is a lecturer on law and senior fellow on senior fellow on global health and rights at the Petrie Flom Center for Health Law Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics at Harvard Law School. And Jamil Dakwar is the director of the Human Rights Program with the American Civil Liberties Union. Thank you all for joining us this morning. Let me kick it off with you, Kate. I think it's important to understand our own country's history, to understand what's happening both in the United States and internationally today. There is this narrative of American exceptionalism, that the U.S. has always been this shining beacon of freedom and democracy. But does our history really bear that out?
Well, thanks so much. Thanks for having me here. It's really wonderful to be here, and I so enjoyed and was inspired by last night's proceeding. So I want to start with a moment that made a huge impression on me. January 6th, 2021, I'm sure made an impression on you all too, when President-elect Joe Biden came out to address the nation. And what he basically said, the themes of his remarks on that really disturbing day were, this is not who we are. When we see these scenes at the Capitol, this does not reflect the true America, Joe Biden said. And I think at that moment, many historians shared the same response as I did, which was, well, this is kind of who we are. And that's something we need to recognize. I felt that way in part because I'd spent a lot of time working on the era of the Civil War and Reconstruction. So what I want to talk about briefly now is how the real history of the United States, especially from the Civil War to the mid-20th century, has in fact been very difficult for many Americans to come to terms with. This period furnishes many examples of white Americans turning to political violence and powerfully rejecting democratic forms of government and the extension of political power to previously marginalized groups. I'm talking specifically about the secession of 11 southern states after the 1860 election, resistance to the creation of a multiracial democracy during Reconstruction, and the systematic disenfranchisement at the turn of the 20th century. My main point here is that in many quarters, there's still a tendency to de-emphasize these facets of U.S. history or to portray them as exceptions to a larger history of American democracy and the rule of law. Maybe we file them away as Southern and therefore not really American. Essentially, many people say, with President Biden, this is not who we really are. But this is wrong. Racist and anti-democratic politics and struggles to combat them have been central to U.S. history and to the U.S. Constitution itself, and they remain crucial in the world we live in today. Anti-liberal, anti-democratic traditions are baked into our history and culture, and we can't alter that fact by wishing them away, deeming them exceptions, or consigning them to the past as if they don't have any impact on the present. So to quickly go beyond these general statements that I just made, let me just give these three examples from the time period that I study most and am most interested in. So first of all, we can understand the secession movement that led to the Civil War as a significant example of Americans refusing to accept the results of an election that everyone agreed at the time was conducted fairly according to their standards. The Southern slave-owning elite had what we would today consider significant authoritarian tendencies. They viciously repressed large portions of their state's population. They interfered with U.S. mail, passed state-level bans on abolitionist publicities for the arrest of abolitionists who dared to enter their jurisdictions. When Lincoln won the presidency in November of 1860, the slave-owning elite rejected the results of the election. They feared the rise of Lincoln and the Republican Party meant restrictions on slavery and maybe even its abolition. Rather than accept the election results as a reflection of shifting political winds and demographic changes and trying to manage their situation from within the American political order, they declared themselves outside of it. The slave owners' rebellion, their assault on the American democracy, ended up costing more than 750,000 American lives. It resulted, of course, in the abolition of slavery, which was precisely what the slave owners had not wanted. Moving on, as Sherilyn Ifill said last night, during Reconstruction, large swaths of Americans used every means at their disposal to halt advances toward multiracial democracy. And the federal government, including the Supreme Court, largely allowed it to happen. When the Civil War ended, Republicans who were in charge of Congress and the presidency attempted to place the country on a new footing, making it, for the first time, a multiracial democracy. Republicans drafted and pushed for ratification of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. By federal mandate, black men began voting in Southern elections in the late 1860s. But powerful coalitions of white Americans completely rejected this new order and attempted to stop multiracial democracy in its tracks. As many people in this room will know, they formed vigilante organizations, including the Ku Klux Klan. At election times, armed men on horseback rode through black communities, threatening violence if people turned out to vote. They set fire to black churches and schools. They visited the homes of black leaders and of white Republicans, delivering threats, whippings, beatings, sometimes sexual assault and murder. In the early 1870s, the newly created Justice Department tried to prosecute some of these crimes and was somewhat successful, but their task far exceeded the manpower available. And when the economy tanked in 1873, Republicans' enthusiasm for enforcement waned. After leaving office, so while federal interventions continued sporadically after 1873, this was the kind of waning of federal enforcement in this period. After leaving office, President Grant conceded or said that the country could have reached a different outcome only if it had significantly extended the military occupation of the former Confederate states. But this, he said, the American people would not tolerate. Quote, "It was not in accordance with our institutions." So for my last example, in the 1890s, numerous American states adopted policies designed to disenfranchise large swaths of their populations, creating what political scientists have called authoritarian enclaves within the United States. These enclaves of authoritarianism persisted until they were broken up in the second half of the 20th century. We might be accustomed to thinking about the disenfranchisement movement of the 1890s as evidence of stark racism, which it certainly was. But we also need to remember that it was a political strategy led by Democrats of the time to entrench their party in power at the state level so they could achieve their policy priorities associated with prosperity for the already wealthy and low wages and few opportunities for everyone else. These state-level Democrats achieved power through authoritarian means, including by squelching voter turnout and stifling dissent, often through threats of violence. And again, these regimes were not broken up until the second half of the 20th century. At the end of the 19th century, as white Southern Democrats were consolidating power, authoritarian rule in their states, the United States projected power outside of North America, engaging in military conflicts and conquests, particularly in Puerto Rico and the Philippines. There, American policymakers drew lessons not only from the consolidation of one-party rule in the South, but also from decades of military conquest, expulsion, and concentration of Native Americans. Americans of many political persuasions understood at the time that they were part of larger global dynamics. Indeed, W.E.B. Du Bois made the connection clear in Souls of Black Folks, published in 1905 when he wrote, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, the relation of the darker to the lighter races of men in Asia and Africa, in America and the islands of the sea. So it's really important to see the history I've just briefly described here, not as anomalous, not as exclusively Southern, but as profoundly American, with consequences extending everywhere. Thanks.
Well, let me follow up with that. This is precisely why one of ACS's top priorities is to demand a national truth, racial healing, and transformation process. Because it's not just because some guy in Florida is running for president and doesn't wants to make political points by not letting people hear about Roberto Clemente and Rosa Parks. It's a deep context, as you just indicated. I'm wondering if you could connect that with today. How does the U.S. history of slavery and racial apartheid inform some of the political struggles that we're experiencing today, especially in terms of the efforts that are being made to delegitimize certain voices or communities and argue that they are therefore less worthy of full democratic participation? And you're thinking, for example, of lies denigrating cities as being sites of out-of-control voter fraud, and the people who live in cities as unruly and violent. Could you connect that with this long history of white nationalism?
Well, it's exactly as you just said. I think when we understand the history that I described, some of these moves now, whether it's to kind of use coded language to talk about the dangerousness of cities or to literally suppress the discussion of this history, these are of a piece with what we've seen in the past. And I want to come back to what Sherilyn Ifill began with last night, which is we're living in a backlash. Part of what we're seeing right now is a response to the progress that people have made toward illuminating a more full, more truthful history of the United States, a history that includes both, the tremendous things that have gone on in this country and also some of the things that we don't feel proud of, that has become more inclusive in terms of multiple voices in our history, multiple perspectives in our history, that have held up human dignity and human rights as kind of central values in our history. And when we see those ideas making inroads into public education, into our politics, there have always been contingents of Americans who reject that, who refuse that, and they feel threatened. And what's going on, I think that the authoritarian enclaves idea is so helpful because what's going on is the federalist structure of the United States allows for the possibility that people in particular jurisdictions can then use their power. It doesn't have to be at the national level. It can be a minority of people, but using power in particular ways, even in subnational jurisdictions, to do the kinds of things that those people have always wanted to try to do, and that is to marginalize, to oppress, to assert power undemocratically.
Thank you, Kate. Craig, I want to turn to you now. Our history of slavery and racial apartheid didn't just have an impact here in the United States. Could you talk a bit about the interconnectedness of authoritarianism domestically and internationally, particularly in the early to the mid-20th century? This is precisely why we wanted this to be the opening plenary, to help us make that connection.
Well, I have to say that what you're going to hear for the next few minutes is the musings of someone who got off the plane last night at 9 o'clock. But fortunately, I teach constitutional law and I teach international law, so I do have some perspectives on that. It seems to me that the notion of tyranny, this may sound dark, but it strikes me as kind of an instinct of humans to tend toward that, and the democracies in the world today have fought that. I think we find that in the framers who attempted, and I'm not a big fan of the framers because they had their problems, but they did structure partially only partially, a constitution that dealt with at least the tyranny that they addressed. And that was the tyranny of Great Britain. England before Great Britain, and of course Great Britain during the 18th century colonial period. And they attempted to try to deal with that by structuring their government in a way that would prevent any kings, any dictators from occurring. And they assumed that there would be a succession of responsible men, as it was understood in that time, and as we understand now, responsible persons who would structure policy based upon a good faith attempt at addressing constitutional limitations. Well, we learned differently in 2016 that that's not always going to work because we don't always have people going into office with good faith. Now, that's just as a preliminary matter. But they understood the nature of tyranny, the framers, and addressed it only partially because they did not really fully address human rights. They wanted to have a federal system, but they didn't want to address human rights at the federal level, at the sub-federal level, at the state level. So the result was a civil war, and finally a realization that you had to have some kind of single body of human rights that governed the whole nation. Now, that being said, from the international perspective, I think it's clear that we didn't invent all the evils of human rights in this country. They came from elsewhere. We are the product of European denials of human rights. Slavery didn't start here. We may have perfected it, but slavery didn't start in the United States. It started elsewhere. It started in Europe. And the tradition of slavery began from that continent and was extended over here through colonialism. But one thing I did want to talk about, though, and just to put it in the perspective of more of a constitutional perspective, if you will, is this conversation, this 2 centuries old conversation that I find fascinating between Roger Taney, Abraham Lincoln, Thurgood Marshall, and Clarence Thomas. A conversation that basically took part in a series of Supreme Court opinions, statements, articles, law review articles about the structure of our own Constitution, our own system. Roger Taney, who was the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, believed that the Constitution did not create any rights that were due to Africans. And he wrote so in the Dred Scott opinion. Abraham Lincoln said that was, I was about to curse. Abraham Lincoln said that was bull. Okay. Thurgood Marshall, 100 years later, 120 years later, after Abraham Lincoln's period, when asked to take part in the celebration of the Constitution, he declined because he shared the view of Roger Taney, not necessarily the purpose or the meaning that Roger Taney had, because I thought Roger Taney would actually believe that the Constitution did not have any rights for blacks. And I think that's actually true, but I think he celebrated that idea in his opinion in Dred Scott. But what Thurgood Marshall was saying in 1987, when former Chief Justice Warren Burger asked him and other members of the court to take part in this celebration in Hawaii, of all places, sorry, I didn't mean that, but to celebrate, and his decision to decline was that we didn't commit ourselves to any kind of civil rights or human rights to ending what you call the enclaves of tyranny until after the Civil War, the 14th Amendment. That's when it really began. So he didn't see any point because the Constitution didn't really exist until the 1860s. Clarence Thomas wrote an article in response to Thurgood Marshall's position. Both articles were in the Howard Law Journal, saying essentially that Abraham Lincoln was right, that you have to read the Constitution within the context of the Declaration of Independence, and that it was a Constitution that was designed to fight tyranny, and that's that. Well, this conversation is one that I can barely have in Texas right now, at a state school at least, where I teach. But it is important to understand that you're right, that our system began as a justification for a certain kind of tyranny. Now, I'm rambling right now, I must admit, but I want to make this one final point. Much of the conversation about the threat to democracy that we're having right now, even among progressive circles, does not address the real core problems having to do with race. I think we tend to limit our discussion about, with regard to voter denial, rather election denialism, and other aspects of authoritarian edicts from the right. But this really began, and I wasn't here to hear Ms. Eiffel last night, but I understand that she did say something about we're living in an era of, I forget the exact term, an era of resentment, an era of retrenchment because of the racial advances that have been made in the past. I think that's absolutely true. But I think the one thing we have to realize that this all began as a response and as a reaction to the election of Barack Obama. That's what made a lot of people angry. And now we see much of this right joining forces with other enclaves internationally of tyranny because there's resentment growing. It has to do a lot with, in our country, it has to do a lot with the Obama presidency, not to mention immigration, and in other parts of the world, including Europe, immigration there. I know my statement is dark, it's unprepared, but I do think, though, that at one time our framers had a sense that we could overcome that. But we have to overcome it not with broad statements, which is the way our Constitution is structured. We have to overcome it with specifics, either legislation or constitutional reform or something of that sort. But the good faith, people of goodwill model of our Constitution, I think has pretty much grown kind of old, and it's not really working. And I think we need to think about some serious constitutional reform. I haven't gone quite as far as constitutional reform in terms of the 9-member Supreme Court, but that's something that's on my thinking list. And recognize that we have to be more specific in how we understand our structure and also our fight against tyranny.
Thank you. And this is a very grim history that we have to tell, and that's probably the most important purpose of this. I will confirm for you what you said about the Obama election. Even though my state overwhelmingly voted for him, within weeks, this movement clearly arose out of the fact that an African American was in the White House, and it is connected with all of this. So I want to foreshadow for a minute, do a follow-up question with you, foreshadow maybe what we can do about this before we get into more of the possibly grim history. And just if you could say a bit about what have human rights activists learned from each other in terms of fighting this sort of thing?
In different countries?
Yeah, or here working with other countries.
Well, I think that, well, I'm going to stick with what we have learned internationally from each other. Another Thurgood Marshall story, he helped to write the Kenyan Constitution in 1961. He was part of the team that was helping negotiate independence for Kenya. He was asked by Tom Mboya and other leaders of the Kenyan movement to come and take part and help them with their negotiations with Great Britain. And why? Because he was a civil rights leader here. Brown versus School Board was an international case, and it was revered by anti-colonial forces throughout the world, and he was asked to take part in those negotiations, and he did. I think that's an example. I think we find in case law of the Constitutional Court of South Africa references to our case law in civil rights, including Brown versus School Board. They're, I guess, a common law country, and they do borrow from the constitutional systems of other common law countries as well. and you see examples of that. Not overwhelmingly, but you do see citations to American constitutional civil rights history in some of their cases. So I think what we want to understand is that even before the globalism, our civil rights movement encouraged a lot of anti-colonial movements worldwide. And as such, they've learned a lot from us, but we learned a lot from South Africa too, in terms of Nelson Mandela and the anti-apartheid movement there. So there is an international focus there.
Thank you so much. That was pretty darn good, having just found out a few minutes ago you were going to do this. Thank you. Alicia, a pernicious but perhaps too often under-discussed tool that authoritarian regimes wield to exert control, particularly control of members within historically marginalized and underrepresented communities, is restrictions on bodily autonomy. Could you discuss how that plays out both abroad and here in the United States, and sort of the trends you're seeing that may be a cause of real concern both here and abroad?
Sure. Well, I also want to add my thanks to the ACS for inviting me to be on this incredible panel, and I was also greatly inspired by the dinner last night. So I want to come to a more recent history, not quite to Dobbs, because long before Dobbs, we have to recognize that many, many women and pregnancy-capable people in this country did not have effective access to abortion rights. Part of that is the framing itself of Roe. Part of it is the austere constitution that the court had to deal with, as Craig suggested. But the framing of a very narrow reproductive autonomy located within privacy. People who have abortions never decide as a purely private matter. It's always a matter of a web of relationships and conditions in their lives. And then shortly thereafter, there was the Hyde Amendment, there was Harris v. McRae, so poor women really didn't have a right to have their abortions funded. And that was huge. And we've seen over the years trap laws and any number of other restrictions on abortion before even Dobbs came down. But in 1994, there was a really important launch of what is a reproductive justice movement by Black feminists in this country, recognizing that the focus on narrow legal entitlements was not relevant to so many people's lives, and focusing on the conditions of if, when, and how all people want to and can have children and raise them in decent conditions. And that same year, there was also a tectonic shift internationally at the International Conference on Population Development that was held in Cairo, where there was a major shift from focusing on demographic imperatives to reproductive rights. But reproductive rights, again, understood in this more holistic sense of needing material conditions to be genuinely free to choose over your body and your life. And since then, and the pioneers of the reproductive justice movement, I'm thinking of Loretta Ross, for example, will say how much synergy there was between what they were trying to achieve in this country and what the international human rights movement was doing. And since then, there have continued to be synergies. There's a focus on intersectionality, a focus on moving beyond kind of formal legal equal protection to a broader notion of substantive equality that takes account of different positionalities and starting positions. And over these 30 years, there has been an incredible interaction between US advocacy and international advocacy, and there is now really an irrefutable overlapping consensus in international law that sees draconian restrictions on abortion and reproductive autonomy as a violation of a right to life with dignity, as a violation of the right to health where that exists, because abortion care is health care, and a kind of gender-based violence as well, so freedom from gender-based violence. But the darker side of this story is that the antis were watching this and in many ways copied our playbook. They saw the synergies. They saw how the normative scaffolding was being built. They started to appropriate space in international forums. Just as there was a backlash to Roe, there was also a backlash to this conference internationally. And by the early 2000s, especially, I would say, you see, for example, the Russian Federation launching a resolution at the Human Rights Council on the rights of traditional families, so collective rights of traditional families as opposed to individual rights. And you fast forward to the Trump administration, under which Secretary of State Pompeo created what he called a Commission on Unalienable Rights, which was supposed to inform him about international human rights law, but also to inform him where international human rights law and discourse deviated from our founders' values and natural rights and natural law. And at the time, there were several Democratic senators who protested, but it didn't get a lot of attention. In 2020, he also worked a lot with other countries around the world, and in 2020, they launched what is called the Geneva Consensus Declaration on Promoting Women's Health and Strengthening the Family. Now, at Harvard, we have something called the Statute of the Three Lies, and this declaration is kind of the declaration of the three lies. It has nothing to do with Geneva, was not signed there, has nothing to do with the UN, and is not binding. It is in no way a reflection of any kind of consensus under international or comparative law, and it is not meant to promote women's health or strengthen real families. It's really an anti-abortion screed. Where it says that there is no right to abortion under international law, that states absolutely do not have to facilitate this, they have no obligation to change their criminal or civil codes whatsoever. And the like-minded countries with which we launched this consensus declaration included countries like Bahrain, Uganda, Belarus, Sudan and South Sudan, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates. So put the United States in pretty bad company in terms of autocracy and gender subordination generally. Some of these countries are among the most oppressive in the world. Now, President Biden withdrew our signature from that declaration, but it continues to exert a disconcertingly strong influence. It has fostered this idea of human rights originalism, which, as anybody who teaches international law, just a few years ago would have been scorned, but is now growing with increasing intensity, and I think it's something we really need to take seriously. The idea of peeling back all of the deliberative processes and consensus building of these normative frameworks over the last 75 years to 1948 and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is not going to stop with abortion and reproductive rights and LGBTQ rights. There was no environmental justice in 1948. There were a lot of things that did not exist in 1948, and I think we need to be really attuned to it.
Well, as I listen to you, I'm thinking a little bit about, not only the direct harm here, but the way in which this is a tactic for broader authoritarian political purposes. I'm thinking of the way in which a group of American religious people and some of the politicians here decided to persuade Uganda to develop a brutally anti-gay regime. Perhaps people were very upset about gay people in Uganda at the time, but I have a feeling it was more to cover what was going on in that regime. And so the follow-up question is, to what extent is this focus on these things a way in which they can distract people? The amount of time that is devoted in our political system to abortion and gay issues and this sort of thing, it just devours the oxygen in the room about things that most people would rather just leave to their own private business and solve the problems we all have together. But it strikes me as a tactic and a strategy as well as a direct attack.
You know, I'm so glad you said that and asked that, Russ, because I really do believe, I mean, at all periods of radical transition, and I think there's no doubt that we're in one, sex and sexuality become highly, highly cathected. But it's clear that the don't say gay bills, the anti-gender affirming care, because it's a triumvirate, traditional patriarchal family, anti-LGBTQ+, anti-abortion and reproductive rights. All of that is a giant smokescreen for the economic precarity that we feel in this country. And of course, you know, when economic and political and legal institutions have not provided what people thought they were promised and they feel resentful, it feeds on that. But we have the moral high ground here. I mean, if we can construct reproductive justice, which it is, reproductive justice is social justice, it's racial justice. These are not woke, upper middle class white people. These are not people who look like me who are dying because they don't have a right to access abortion, right? This is an issue of social justice, and the more that we can connect with a discourse that broadens it out and create and hold the narrative, I think we'll be much, much better off in this country and abroad, because the same thing is happening at the international level. Neoliberal globalization is the fault of people who want rights for gender equality and LGBTQ+ populations. And they're against the natural order, and we need to fight that.
Thank you. Before I turn to Jamil, is this the time to give the second code? Or am I premature here? Okay. I'm excited to do it. PALM, all caps, P-A-L-M, your second CLE code. Jamil, you're the perfect person to give the next presentation. Something we've seen a great deal of here in the United States is appeals to the religious rights as a way to undermine equal liberty rights for women, members of the LGBTQ+ community, and other marginalized groups. Are we seeing this happening in other places in the world? Obviously, I alluded to it to some extent in my previous remarks, and if so, how much does this reflect an effort to export these ideas, developed here in the United States, to oppressive regimes throughout the world?
Thank you for inviting me and being here and listening to these distinguished speakers. There's a lot of parallels that we see as part of what I would describe as a transnational, ideologically conservative movement that, you know, as you described, they not only have learned from the playbook of the growing movement, international human rights movement, but they also have realize that the way that you have to make the change is not just an international level, is how to bring it back to the very local level, the very national level. And this is where the disconnect where our movement for progressive movement, I would say, to advance rights internationally has been stuck in how do you really bring it back to the local and national level. And the right, we would say, a conservative right movement on issues of women's rights, gender equality or gender inequality, family, the unity of the family, or all these things that we've seen, anti-LGBTQI agendas, has been really rooted in the idea that we have to protect this kind of structures of power that the patriarchal that were described, but also prevent movement toward the multiculturalism, multicultural societies and democracies. And I think that we've seen as ACLU 12 years ago, we've seen that this is not just happening in the US. And although the ACLU is a national organization that is focused on the United States, we interact and we have actually international civil liberties and human rights policy from many years ago that when I joined the ACLU, nobody was really paying attention to, and I looked at it as from really the founders of the ACLU were interested in international connections to civil liberties in particular, even though sometimes it happened in a very imperial way that I would not agree with today. But there was a sense that And there was contribution also to the UDHR in 1948, but there was a sense that what happens internationally impacts us and vice versa. And so what the ACLU did 12 years ago, seeing that the setbacks and the attacks on fundamental rights and civil liberties and human rights happening in many other national contexts, we came together with other similarly situated organizations, sister organizations from what is now 15 countries that go from India all the way to Argentina, really all continents, from South Africa to the Middle East, looking at Egypt and Israel as countries where there's a lot of movements, in repressive movements continuing. And we created international organizations or network for addressing these threats. And we focused on 4 areas that we thought that were really, we saw those parallels. We saw that those similar abuses and setbacks and attacks on individual rights, but also on communities, particularly in the context of the use of religion to discriminate, and particularly on gender discrimination and LGBTQI discrimination. We have also focused on the use of surveillance as a way to undermine democratic freedoms and rights. We have focused on the right to protest and freedom of expression, or we're seeing there's a huge attack on that happening worldwide. And that would include freedom, internet freedom, online, so the right to express yourself online and offline. And the last was really looking at the closing of the civic and democratic space. From NGOs, civil society organizations declared illegal or as terrorist entities that have been really exported by the US laws after 9/11 of designating certain entities as terrorist organizations, and that have led to, as we know, the UN taking actions shortly after 9/11, but continue to press for more legally binding measures at the national level that were really adopted at the international level by the Security Council under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, where countries had to adopt measures, laws, and other measures in order to address terrorism threats. And many authoritarian regimes where this for them was a gift of taking something that was, it's the UN compelling us. We have to act based on the UN Charter obligations. And what happened is that you've seen many countries around the world enacting these repressive laws that had an impact on the most marginalized in communities. So the post-9/11 era is important to highlight because there was huge setbacks to the international human rights movement. And we're still living it because many of the structure, many of the architecture that was created after 9/11 remained and became normalized. That impacted different people. But I think the other thing that we see is that there's a exclusion of legitimate voices from participating in any sort of. There's a spectrum from countries like where India, one of the largest democracies in the world, sliding back into a country that is designating against entities as terrorist organizations, limiting very basic freedoms, using both anti-terrorism laws but also foreign agent laws, as we've seen in Russia and other countries. So we've seen really parallel copycat laws being adopted in different countries. In Israel, for example, the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, which is a member of INCLO, have warned against these designations, not only as laws that were adopted in Israel to declare particular entities that they have to declare themselves as receiving foreign money, but use the anti-terrorism framework to designate 6 Palestinian human rights organizations as terrorist organizations. And we've seen that happening in other countries and contexts as well. So the question, what do we do about that? And for us it's not only, it's a matter of how do we change our strategies in a way that we push back against those actions, but we also have a proactive strategy to create a space and to ensure that these communities and activists and human rights defenders are able to act without being subjected to these restrictions. And these are serious restrictions. We take for granted some of these things here in the United States, although I think I want to echo some of the sentiments that were made for the US context. The most marginalized communities have not really enjoyed over centuries and decades of American democracy the freedoms that are taken for granted and seen as something that we all enjoy. And when we've seen those protests happening, not just in the summer of 2020, but before that, with the rise of a Black Lives Matter activist, the anti-DAPL, the Dakota Access Pipeline, and the indigenous-led movement against extraction development projects from South Dakota to Minnesota to other parts of the country, we've seen all of a sudden the same actors that have been pushing against issues of abortion rights, issues on fossil fuel industries are taking measures or pushing for measures at the state level to restrict the right to protest, to restrict the right to peaceful assembly. I don't know how many of you know, but since 2017, we've had 21 states enacting at least 40 anti-protest bills that apply draconian penalties for common nonviolent protest. I'm talking about harsher penalties, fees, damage and security costs, for blocking traffic, for damaging monuments, for inciting riot, and nobody really provides the definition of what that means. Immunity for drivers who injure people who block the traffic. And so very serious things, and that's happening in almost 40 other states. 40 states have other actions. And those are serious setbacks that I think have parallels in other countries. One other thing that I want to mention that, again, doesn't get much attention is even fundamental First Amendment rights, as the right to boycott, have been under attack. Again, we've seen at least since 2016, 28 states have passed laws requiring individuals and businesses that receive government contracts from teachers, substitute teachers, to contractors and construction workers to certify that they will not participate in boycotts of Israel or the Israeli settlements, just as an example, right? Now the right to boycott restrictions is not just in the context of boycotting Israel. It has been adopted as copycat again in the context of the fossil fuel advocacy against oil and gas industries. It has been adopted in the context of other activism, which makes it really problematic from our point of view. So and one last thing I want to mention about that concentrated effort. This is not happening but where legislature are just coming together and saying, oh, we have a problem in our state. Usually there is no problem. And it's really, just as we saw with the anti-Sharia laws, if you remember several years ago, all of a sudden all states have been enacting these anti-Sharia and sometimes comparative or international law. And there was really no problem. There was no issues. The Sharia law had no basis at all and had no bearing on U.S. policy or U.S. laws, and yet that was intended to attack the idea that even though legislatures and state courts were not really adopting or looking at international law or comparative law, but yet they've seen the movement and particularly looking at othering Muslims in particular and people who are seen as a threat after 9/11. That was part of it, and those legislative initiatives were organized. They were organized by ALEC, which a group that goes around and it's pay for pay. You provide. They provide the legislatures with the copycat. They bring support them and connect them with businesses, and they make that influence. So these are not something that are unrelated. So I think I want to stop here because there's a lot that we can cover, but I wanted to just mention a few other things that maybe we can talk about it in our discussion, is that the same restrictions that we see in other areas, like voting rights, voter suppression laws, media restrictions, criminalization of activism, as I mentioned. These are all connected.
Let me just follow up by asking you to talk about one that you didn't mention. By the way, really pleased you mentioned this growing anti-protest law. I think we're increasingly interested in this. But after last night, when we heard that incredible presentation about prisons, and when I think about ACS's substantial involvement in the international coalitions against the death penalty that we've been doing in the last couple of years, talk a little bit about how the criminal legal system plays a role in attacking the marginalized communities.
Absolutely. You know, this goes back to, again, connecting what Greg was talking about, you know, original sin of what the constitutional legal system in the United States have had an exclusion of communities and also enforcing them into or denying their basic human rights from day one. Not only African people of enslaved Africans, but also indigenous peoples. And then when you come into the more recent history of seeing the notions of how fear played, using fear as a motive and motivation for legislation and different policies, you see how we moved from the civil war era, post-Civil War era, the Jim Crow, and then post-Jim Crow, how certain laws have remained on the books that allowed disenfranchisement of people, particularly in the context of voting rights, and felon disenfranchisement laws are a huge impediment to many millions of Americans of the right to vote, over 5 million, 5.5 million, I believe the number is. The fact that we have not abolished what we call the slavery provision in our Constitution, federal Constitution, and the state constitutions. Just last elections, 4 of 5 states abolished the slavery provisions in their constitution. These are connected to what is happening in the way that mass incarceration has resulted from creating the narrative and the describing the reality that there should be laws that would be fight the crime laws and being tough on crimes and particularly singling out marginalized communities, particularly black and brown communities, had dire consequences. And we've seen that continuing, and that's why people are not just talking about reforming some of the laws, like mandatory minimums, or like abolishing the death penalty, which we know that is racist and arbitrary and has serious problems of wrongful convictions and sentencing people and all of these problems. But we're talking about systemic changes that needed to be made, particularly in the way that we have seen the criminal legal system have root causes that we have not really addressed. We have not reckoned with these root causes. In the summer of 2020, I think there was a last stark reminder for us that and in a way that what we need to do is not just tinkering with the tips, with the edges, but really deeply deal with the underlying root causes of why we are seeing the criminal legal system and how do we move from the carceral system to a system that really values people's human dignity and rights, invest in communities, not in policing and in a carceral system, not in punitive, but more other alternatives to ways of doing justice. All of these things are so important, and they have an international echo chamber. We've seen at the UN Human Rights Council in the summer of 2020, because of the call of families of victims of police violence in the United States, including George Floyd's family, a call for the UN and the international community to look at extrajudicial killing of black Americans and systemic racism and the crackdown on anti-racism protesters. And that led to, even though the US at the time under the Trump administration vigorously opposed and rejected the notion that the U.S. would be singled out for an international investigation. It gathered other former colonial powers, right? Back to the point about the role of colonialism to present day. Former colonial powers doing the bidding for the United States, like UK and Australia and New Zealand and Canada joining as well, and the EU as a whole, in pushing back and said, no, 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 no. This is not a U.S. problem. This is a world phenomenon. This is a phenomena. It's not an issue just for the U.S. And push for moving away from using the moment of the Black Lives Matter movement, calling out the U.S. and doing something that haven't been done and should have been done since Du Bois appealed to the world in 1947, where he called on the UN to do what it promised to do, that is to address human rights issues in the US. And the US, since 1947 and 48, the Declaration, we have really, and that is actually true to both the Democrats and Republicans, we have, as a country, denied the idea of implementing international human rights in the United States, because it was, again, seen as a framework that will expand rights, that will provide marginalized communities with their basic human rights that the Constitution did not provide.
Thank you, Jamil.
Particularly in the context of economic and social rights.
We only have a marvelous answer. We just have a little over 10 minutes left. So what I'm going to do is I'm waiting for, I shouldn't have even said it. It happened. Let me throw a jump ball question to you folks, and then we'll take some of the questions from the crowd. Talk a little bit about efforts of authoritarians and would-be authoritarians to erode the independence of and capture courts, and the importance of an independent judiciary in combating authoritarianism.
So can I jump in here? Because I think it follows on what Jamil was saying. You know, my family is from Argentina, and I very well could have grown up there, but for a brutal dictatorship. If you go back to the 1970s, the courts were quite irrelevant in Argentina and Latin America. The right looked to the military to protect property. The left went to the politics of the street, to the bush, to insurgencies. And it was later, at the end of the 1980s, after democracy returned, the beginning of the 1990s, the same thing happened in post-apartheid South Africa. And later, a whole nother wave. I was involved in the 2010 Kenyan constitution and now in the Chilean process. But this was the idea that constitutions could be transformative. It's called transformative constitutionalism, or in Latin America, new social constitutionalism. And those constitutions were very different from the former ones that were like ours with very austere sets of rights. They incorporated socioeconomic rights, they incorporated international human rights law to differing degrees, sometimes directly into the text, and that set up a very different role for courts. I think of judicial independence as two things: judicial autonomy, or how politics influences the courts, both pre-appointment and then how beholden judges are after appointment, and authority or scope of jurisdiction, how the courts influence society. And in both of those, that sort of 2x2 analysis, this change in constitutionalism really changed the relationship between courts and society. Again, I'm not claiming that Latin America is a paragon of the rule of law by any stretch of the imagination, but it was absolutely critical for allowing what Jamil to talk about, this recursive influence back, to have international norms inform, not top-down dictate, but inform broader dialogues, taking reasons seriously, thinking about things in a way that maybe Catholic law schools didn't allow them to do. And that is what has allowed progress on the issues that I talked about first, on same-sex marriage, on civil unions, on abortion, and other issues of reproductive justice. We just saw the green wave in some of the most populous countries in the region through legislation in Argentina, but through judicial opinions in Mexico and Colombia, and further in other countries. So that has been extremely important, that recursive relationship between international and national constitutional law that is, as Jamil suggested, somewhat very much more blocked and constrained here unless we think about it in a different way and go to the states.
I don't want to shortchange our audience, which has submitted some good questions, so I'm going to switch to that. Professor Masur, the question for you: how are you and other historians trying to ensure people still learn that history in situations in which resistance might not be fully successful? How should lawyers and law professors think about that challenge?
Yeah, this is such a great question. I mean, how do we fight back against the current restrictions on honest teaching of history? And this is an issue, as you know, at the state level in many different states. It is an issue in K-12 education, but also in higher education. And in Illinois, for example, it's not an issue at the state level. We're, securely in the hands of a Democratic legislature and governor, but it's still an issue at certain county and school district levels. And so, I don't have a single answer to this. The American Historical Association, which is the largest professional association of historians, is doing what it can as a nonpartisan organization to respond when people in states that are under threat ask for them to come in and kind of write a letter or lobby and say, here's what our profession understands to be good history teaching. On an individual kind of state-by-state level, I know that educators are coming together to push back against these laws. My sense from reading reporting on this is that some of the organizations that are pushing for these laws are loud but small. Moms for Liberty, these kind of organizations don't necessarily represent the majority of people in their communities, but they're very well organized. And so, I think we need to look at this at every level. And I mean, I've been flummoxed by this question myself because I'm not in a place where I can directly feel like I can do something. I know, though, I mean, and as Sherilyn Eiffel said last night as well, like, teachers and librarians are also our people, right? That teachers have been through hell in the last few years because of the pandemic. They're already underpaid and under-resourced. And so anything that we can do to stand behind teachers, to support teachers, to put resources in the hands of teachers, to create alternative curricula and there is a lot of that going on, right, that they can draw on from outside of the textbooks that they're required to teach. So I think there's every kind of level that we can think about this on, and I think, the question itself sort of opens the door to a lot of different types of action that we can take.
Thank you, Kay. Let me read this one and see who wants to respond. Authoritarian degradation of democracies is not a new phenomenon. That the historical accounts often focus on countries who did not pull out of that tailspin, from Weimar Germany to Tunisia and Sudan now. What example can any of you point to of a country that did successfully redeem its degrading democracy? And what can we learn from that to save ours? Stumping the panel. Panel stumped.
No, I would say South Africa.
Go ahead. Talk about it.
Yeah, well, no, South Africa, it's a growing democracy, and we can have a whole panel on the constitutional system in South Africa, but it wrested control from apartheid, from a minority government, and it created that process created what many people regard as the best constitution in the world right now. And along the lines of what you're talking about, the South African Constitution, obviously I think constitutionalism is the key here. The South African Constitution, along with some of the more modern, some of the newer constitutions, did specify what the human rights are. Instead of the broad language that we use in our Constitution, as you alluded to, the South African Constitution was very specific as to what the rights are and how they're to be understood, giving less leeway, if you will, or discretion, to the court for interpretation. And we've seen this in the past year, since last June, how a court can go off rails with bizarre interpretations of basic human rights. And the more detailed the constitutions are, the less likely that's going to happen with regard to high courts in those countries. So I think that's an example. I don't want to speak to
Well, South Africa is a great example, given, I'll go to you in 1 second, they're talking about challenging the very strong constitutional court, which is a really important part of that Constitution. So they're being tested, but if they can get through it, it'll be marvelous. Alicia.
I think they're being tested in that regard. I also think South Africa points to the need to take other structural measures to dismantle apartheid, right? The economic disparities in South Africa are horrific, and they are still racialized economic disparities. So while I agree that the court has some of the most amazing jurisprudence, one of my favorite quotes that I always use in class is from Albie Sachs, who was the first president of the court. He said, isn't the function of constitutional justice to convert misfortune to be endured, to injustice to be remedied? And I think in South Africa, just as here, we need to start to think more broadly about what are the kinds of economic and social injustices that really require remedies. And having grown up in Argentina, I can say that democracy has been very imbued into me, is not something you can ever take for granted. It's something that you have to cultivate and protect and be willing to go to the streets for all the time.
I just want to say on South Africa, because we know from what happened in the last decade, and also the way that South Africa treated migrants and refugees is in horrible ways. So the issue of migration and immigration, even of African, that was, even with the best constitution that you have, those issues were really serious threat to the society. And I totally agree with the economic disparities and economic structural problems that remain. We hear it from our partner, the Legal Resource Center, that's part of INCLO. So I think that South Africa, yes, made a huge progress in abolishing apartheid, but in many ways, I think it's also sliding on the international level where, for example, its position on the ICC, the International Criminal Court, is very, very troubling, where it was one of the champions of international accountability mechanisms. Now we're seeing that they are doing some, zigzagging on that, which is really not really great for a country like South Africa.
We have 2 minutes left, so I have time for one more interesting question from the audience. Do liberals and progressives bear any responsibility for setting the conditions under which various forms of authoritarianism and fascism can take root and thrive in the United States at a popular level?
For me.
You look like you want to answer it. Go ahead.
I mean, I wonder where that question is coming from. I think, here's what else, I don't know, of course, to the extent that people, we could sort of always criticize liberals and progressives for not doing enough, for not fighting harder, for being complicit or subscribing to systems that are ultimately really coercive or really degrading. And yet I have a hard time right now, because of the context that we're all talking about, really emphasizing that as opposed to the need to find common cause, right? And the need to kind of come together with people with whom we share some things in common, maybe not everything in common. And to say, look, we can't really afford to be purists about every issue right now when the house is on fire. And so I think, we all can deal with some self-examination about our own shortcomings and about the things we could have done or the things that our allies could have done. But I also think this is a time to kind of move forward and think about the ways that we need to come together, find allies, and create agendas that can really combat the crisis that we're in. So yes, and is my sort of answer to that question.
Thank you so much, everybody. It is very important to have this sort of panel. ACS feels strongly about the connectivity between domestic and international authoritarianism and the ways to contrast it, and we want to continue this work, and nothing could be better than to have a panel like this to help us really advance our work in this area. Thank you so much, everybody.